So there was a minor delay in posting assignments yet for Module 3, but as the weekend was starting, I sent notice out to other classes who are currently using virtual machines. You will be using virtual machines for the remainder of the module solutions in one capacity or another, and you're going to be using virtual machines to sort of try to hack each other after we establish ethical use parameters, right? So this is just an extension of what we were talking about reviewing on Friday. I did not, I think I thought I had sent this notice to everyone. Everyone remembers this assignment, correct? Optimizing your personal technology, where we were interested in understanding your native host capacity. Now, by host capacity, I mean how much hardware resources does your personal technology have? So part of this assignment was to determine or register how many gigs of RAM, how many gigs of hard drive space, what kind of CPU do you have with cores, what kind of activity are you having? So the purpose of that activity was twofold. We wanted to get you in a healthy state, and we wanted to kind of have a good feel for whether or not you could, excuse the pun, hack it with your own system when we start using virtual machines, or if you would need to use an alternative resource, okay? Now, what hit over the weekend, and this is critically important, I may ask you to repeat this assignment as we begin Module 4. And that's because I want you to do the first part of the incident handling as your solution for Module 3, which includes a simulation of a physical environment. You remember on Friday, I used my video camera and showed you a monitor and the keyboard and the mouse. Everybody remembers that, right? Okay, so the Module 3 solution will engage the proper authorization and what we call physical acquisition, or first phase of acquisition. You would work in collaboration with digital forensics specialists. Incident handlers either preserve the evidence or they participate in the collection of selected evidence and artifacts as a part of a team, right? So in Module 3, when we post this, so I'm going to restructure your solution, and I'm going to do this as a matter of consequence for what played out over the weekend. So I'm going to split your solution down into 2 halves instead of one big blast. And what you'll do in Module 3 is complete half or phase 1 of what we would refer to as digital forensics acquisition, okay? Module 4 and 5, you'll be using Kali Linux in a virtual machine, and you'll be using that to acquire disk images from what you collected in phase 1. So phase 1 is physical hands-on. Ooh, here's a thumb drive. A thumb drive is plugged into Sidney Corinth's machine. Are you with me? And do you get to take that thumb drive with you? Once you have permission properly from the leadership in that organization, and you've signed off on a code of ethics, and you've also filed a non-disclosure agreement. Can you do it then? If it's part of the scope of work? Yes, you can. You would take pictures of, oh, here's the thumb drive plugged in. This is what I found. And then you would capture a pristine, precise, forensically sound image of that USB thumb drive. And then you would go ahead and restore the system state so that Sydney Corinth is none the wiser when he or she dials in from a distance to perpetrate their nefarious activities. Are you with me?
Yes.
Because if Sydney Corinth checks in and sees, hey, where's my thumb drive? Why don't I see my thumb drive? Why isn't my thumb drive plugged in? Look, here I am. I'm in file. I'm dialing in from a distance. Oh, I'm in Brazil now, but I got to get something off that secret thumb drive in that hidden portion of the thumb drive, right? And oh, where's my thumb drive? I don't see my thumb drive, right?
No.
You don't, just like you don't see a thumb drive here, this would be, in a word, bad. If the state Sydney left his or her machine in included a portable portable disk, right? I've plugged something into the back of the system to try to hide the fact that what am I doing? I'm exfiltrating company data, organization data from the nonprofit I've come to loathe. So now I've stuck that in the back of my PC and I'm using it as a convenient store, and I actually have perhaps an accomplice who can kind of slip in and, you know, drop that sucker in an envelope and FedEx it overnight, or better yet, use DHL, Deutsche Handgepäcklieferung. Deutsche Handgepäcklieferung, or DHL, is the German version of FedEx, and there are a few corners of the world they don't touch. You can find DHL trucks in the Amazon rainforest, where you don't find other delivery couriers. Anyway, all I'm saying is, you see here, we don't have a thumb drive. So I beg your patience while we retool the solution for module 3. So we break it down into a part 1, part 2, phase 1, phase 2 kind of thing, okay? And then I want to talk about this. What hit as we started into the weekend and began a flurry of activities and other courses was the sudden release by Microsoft of what's called a feature update. Feature update is not a cumulative update that you see every month, every month, every month. When you look at the update history, what you typically see each month is cumulative update, cumulative update, cumulative update, cumulative update. Everybody see that? Cumulative update for each month, or sometimes twice a month, right? So they bundle all the updates together. And this is a challenge. But when you see a feature update, I want you to notice 2020, the version of Windows that was loaded with the feature update was 20H2, hence 2020. Here's 21H2, right? Now, what's going on now? Over the weekend, they released 2022. This is an entire forklift replacement of the whole operating system. And VirtualBox announced that they had all sorts of huge vulnerabilities. Did I not share with you about VirtualBox yet? Hadn't shared with you about VirtualBox?
No.
One of the cybersecurity authorities, CISA, so it's a branch of the government, federal government, put out a notice that said, hey, all Oracle products have a serious exposure. They need to be patched immediately. This resulted in, or was timed with, the release of a whole new version number for VirtualBox. Now, in all my other classes where we're already using virtual machines and using VirtualBox, the scramble was on to install a whole new version of VirtualBox. Now, if you're in another class and you haven't updated to 7.0.2 yet, you're going to want to do that because over the last week, all that was playing out. But then as the weekend started, Microsoft was having such profound problems on so many different levels. And they would probably deny that and say, no, Professor Kentop is sadly mistaken. We plan to release that new feature update for Windows 10, so everybody would get a fresh new operating system. Now, if you're a Mac user, do we have any Mac users in the audience here? Any Mac? Any Mac fans? Do we have any MacBook, Mac Mini, iMac?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, all right. So if you have Monterey, you notice that Monterey has different incremental version numbers. So Monterey is the latest whole number that's released. But even Monterey has monthly cumulative updates. So you can be on Monterey 12. I'm sorry, Milan, what version is, if you go to About This Mac, what is it, 12 dot?
Mine is 12.6.
12.6, outstanding. But you could end up with a 12.6.1, 12.6.2, 12.6.3, and that's like the Mac world's version of a cumulative update. As long as you're on 12.6, you know that you're on the major latest release. And I think that's Monterey, right, Milan? Monterey?
Yes.
Okay. And before that, it was, oh man, they had all sorts of them. Capitan, El Capitan, Yosemite. And then before that, they had all these cat names like Cougar and, or Mountain Lion and Tiger and Snow Leopard and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, the point is you want to be on the latest version of Windows. If you have not updated to the latest version of Windows, so I'm going to recast the assignment. What am I saying? I'm going to repost this assignment with a twist. And I'm going to want you to load the latest feature update. Now, if you're running Windows 11, there is also a new feature update for Windows 11 out there. And it's very important that you're on the latest version of Windows 11. And I'm going to post what number that is. In any case, that's an important thing to do as we take up Module 4 in preparation for phase 2 of your incident handling / data acquisition activity, okay? Any questions about what's coming ahead? So my goal is to have all this out online in Blackboard by the end of the day. What are we doing the rest of the day? I know you're going to say Professor Kentop's a liar after a point, but I did want to blitz through some of the laws. I want to call out some of the significant cyber laws or federal laws that have cyber components specifically, explicitly, as a part of this class before we close out Module 3, because you're likely to get some assessment questions about Sarbanes-Oxley or Graham-Leach-Bliley or HIPAA or the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And you're going to want to know something about those things. So we want to basically just blitz through that. There was a question here on St. Croix. Yes, please.
What version is the new one for Oracle?
7.0.2. And funny thing, 7.0.0 was so bad in 3 or 4 days of release that Oracle normally posts information and availability for previous versions of their product online. So if you have to roll back to a previous version, you can. And there is no link for 7.0.0. It doesn't exist, which to me is hilarious. It's like, now, last week I was telling people in my other class, one of the things you should, if you're interested in availability, remember we talked about 5 nines, availability 99.999% of the time, which means you're only down a few minutes out of an entire year. If you want to avoid being down in an entire year, you never install a 7.0.0. Any .0 version release is usually full of bugs, which begs the question by all of my students in all of my other classes, what the hell were you thinking, Professor Kentop, when you told all of us to upgrade to 7.0.0? Well, I was looking at the CISA alert that said, it's all exposed, quick, load the new version. And I thought, okay, this is a good life lesson here. And I told some of the classes, this may go badly. If you load a .0, sometimes they're fraught with bugs. And it's usually a good idea to wait for the, I don't know, .03, .02, or .1, you know, and not just jump for the .0. We were not disappointed. It was hamburger for 3 of the classes, half of last week. And we were scrambling how to figure out how to make it all stable and smooth and hot. And you dodged that bullet in this class. But for those of you that are in the other classes, I know you're shaking your head right now. All right. Let's get into it so we can do this. Any other questions before we go? Okay, so we have been through the summaries of the chapter 6, or as your textbook authors call it, module 6. And we've talked about the essentials of law and ethics and how they differ, right? The basic concepts. What I want to do is drill into specific laws that bubble to the surface. Remember that policies are the local version of law, written law for an organization. And everybody forgets that. It's like when you're talking about law, they don't understand. Now, policy is different from law in that if you break a policy, you don't go to jail. I think we've said this. You don't go to jail, but you lose your job probably. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's a different animal, right? Business policies function as blank law and must be crafted and implemented with care to ensure they are complete, appropriate, and fairly applied to everyone. And you know, which of these are we talking about here? Which of these? I hear organizational. Do I hear a second? Does anyone else want to second that selection by one of our students? The answer is organizational. Wow, you might have been afraid that we were going to trick you. Or you're already multitasking somewhere else, because I hear a lot of other clicks on a screen nearby me that probably have nothing to do with what I'm doing right now. So just saying. Or not, maybe not. Okay. Types of law. We did talk about criminal and civil, did we not? So we talk about constitutional law. Everybody's familiar with the US Constitution. And now we have the Bill of Rights. Yes, we have the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is not it's not passed by a legislature as a statute formally. It's a part of our Constitution, right? So yeah, that's actually something that a lot of people overlook. And there is something about reasonable privacy and protection against search and seizure. And protection against search and seizure is where things in cyber get sticky. If you pull thumb drives out of computers without permission, that's where you get into trouble, right? That's a constitutional example, okay? Protection against unreasonable search and seizure. So, you know, hey, I want to look at your smartphone. Somebody says, a professor says to you, I think you're cheating. I want to see your screen. You can say, well, last I checked, there was a US Constitution against unreasonable search and seizure. And it's not like I'm interested in not being cooperative, but there's a boundary here and there's a proper process to follow. And then the professor can say, well, okay, here are your options. We can refer you to the Dean of Student Affairs for disciplinary action, or you can cooperate with me. And so sometimes there's a little bit of a lever that's used, and people try to use those levers, not the least of which would be law enforcement officers who try to do that kind of thing all the time. It's like, okay, we can go down to the station. Would you prefer we go down to the station instead? And then folks are like, no. So then they freely waive their rights without understanding where the boundaries are. It's like, no, I do not consent to your search of my vehicle. You do not have proper probable cause. I've done nothing wrong. And under your laws, there's no call for you to haul me down to the police station. I'm not uncooperative. I'm not resisting arrest or doing anything that's wrong. Now you got to be pretty sure of what you're talking about whenever you do that stuff. In any case, the laws that legislatures pass. So when we found an entire country and we have a constitution or what's called a declaration, or both, Declaration of Independence and a constitution, right? Those are what we call seminal documents, right? Foundation documents. And then when the legislature gets together and they start passing laws, you have civil and criminal. You also have regulatory and administrative. Now, this is a fun part, but a president can say, okay, I have to do certain things under law. And in order for me to effectively execute the laws of the United States of America, the following is now required of all federal agencies and anyone who works with the federal government. When they do that, it's like policy, but it carries the weight of law. A federal agency can require a regulatory, they can post what's called a mandate, right? One of the things that really ticks off citizens is something called an unfunded mandate. When the executive branch says effective immediately. Now, who's the executive branch in the U.S. Virgin Islands?
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, who's the executive branch? Who's the head of the executive branch in the U.S. Virgin Islands? Or in the United States of America? I mean, you have senators and they would be your legislature, right? So who heads up? Right, the president or the leader. So who's the lead of the agencies that operate based on the laws, the legislators, the senators, right? Governor is correct. Governor is correct. So the governor is. On the regional level or state level, it's governor. On the federal level, it's president, right? And if the governor says, effective immediately, we're declaring martial law because of the natural disaster that occurred. We had an earthquake. It was a 7 point whatever. I mean, heaven forbid that happens. Oh, and there was a tsunami. So now we're dealing with, we have a curfew in effect. Those are regulatory. And if you're in violation of a regulatory, you still get in trouble, right? I mean, if you're out on curfew, there's no law about Hurricane Maria curfew, but there was one. And that was a regulatory mandate. Now, if somebody says, hey, we're going to do this way, and they require a lot of a business or an organization, and there's no way to pay for it, that's called an unfunded mandate. So they make it mandatory to do a certain thing, like all trucks in the Virgin Islands must have new tires. Because we've had too many blowouts on the streets. So the Department of Transportation says all trucks will have brand new tires. And everybody freaks out and they're like, I don't have a budget for brand new tires right now. I just bought them. Mine are only 2 years old. They only have 10,000 miles on them. And these are 40,000 mile rated tires. Too bad, so sad, go out and get new tires. Who pays for that? That's an unfunded mandate. Everybody understand? Okay. Common case and precedent. Case and precedent, that has to do with the courts. So when they have a court case, we've talked about this, and a decision is made that is referred to as precedent. Notice how it's spelled, not president as in president of the United States. Precedent with a C, okay? Private versus public, right? Disney World has private laws. They have a private jurisdiction. Relevant US laws. The United States has been a leader. There have been other leaders in recent years. The European Union is requiring more and better cybersecurity than the United States of America. In certain regards, that is a fact. And we are playing catch up with everybody. We are still a leader in terms of cyber law in many other regards. And we've set the example for everyone else to emulate. So here's where we go into the specific examples. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. See, we really are going to get this done. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986 wasn't in place for very long before a gentleman working out of the Cornell graduate department invented the world's first computer worm, a self-propagating nasty that crawled as like a worm would across and between computer systems in different institutions, and he turned that sucker loose. His name was Morris. And Morris, basically he made history because he was like one of the first to get prosecuted under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So right after they passed this thing, here's this graduate student at Cornell University named Morris who says, wouldn't it be fun if we had something malicious and it just crawled off and it took on a life of its own? And he was one of the first to like invent a pretty bad Morris, a worm, right? And then they traced it, of course, they traced it back to him. They figured out where it came from, and he got in trouble, and he actually was prosecuted. Remember that 1 out of 10, 1 out of 10, 1 out of 10, 1 out of 10, 1 out of 10 thing we went through? Okay. And you remember how I said Adam and Eve, you will get caught? Well, Morris was doing something cutting edge and thought, oh, it's going to be a long time before they catch up with this. It caused enough damage where they're like, we're going to find the scumbag that did this. And they did. And within a couple of months, he was like behind bars. So anyway, National Information Infrastructure Protection Act of 1996. So as we get into close to the year 2000, computers start popping up everywhere. In 1986, you didn't have very many computers. And if you did, they used something called floppy disks. And they weren't connected. Only mainframe computers were connected using telephone lines with an old-timey thing called a modem. And it would squeal across regular phone lines. It was kind of cute. But very, very old school, very Neanderthal, Stone Age kind of stuff by modern day standards. And yeah, even then you had somebody that figured out how to cause problems. The National Information Infrastructure Protection Act started to happen because between 86 and 96, computers became commonplace in most mid-size and larger organizations and on the desktops of many affluent people. This is the advent of things called the IBM personal computer and the Apple Macintosh. Those first computers broke onto the scene between these two time frames. And that's an important perspective to understand. It's like all of a sudden we have tech in the hands of everybody, right? Severity of penalty were judged on the value of the information. So what was important about this? Well, when Morris was prosecuted, those components or criteria didn't exist. You can have increasing penalty based on how much damage it causes based on 1996. In the early 2000s, there was a young kid who was like 14 years old that created a script called the Love Bug in the Philippines. And they chased him down and caught up with him and then threw him in jail. And now he's a cyber consultant somewhere. He's making $10 million. Anyway, US Patriot Act of 2001, right? So law enforcement, we've talked about that in Edward Snowden. So that's on the radar screen, of course, as a milestone in 2001. So it didn't take long. When did 9/11 happen? 9/11. What year? 2001. And what happened before the end of 2001? We got the US Patriot Act. Now think about it. Democrats and Republicans, how well do they get along together? How long did it take for us to have a Patriot Act of 2001? They had to debate it, draft it, approve it, pass the House, pass the Senate, get in front of the president, sign off on the president before it would become a law. And how long did that take? Oh, only a few weeks left of 2001. They really pushed this, right? Which kind of gives you perspective. It's like, how did Edward Snowden thing happen? Well, they were in a hurry, okay? Since then, there have been revisions. And what's important to understand is that the Patriot Act was improved and reauthorized sometime after that. And then we have the USA Freedom Act, which is a successor to the Patriot Act, right? So since 2015, the USA Freedom Act replaces the Patriot Act, which expired in 2015. So Congress by that point was pretty disgusted with the US federal government, and they didn't reauthorize the Patriot Act by 2015. They're like, yeah, no, we're going to do away with Patriot Act. Most people don't know that. They still know about 9/11. They still hear about the Patriot Act. And believe it or not, there are still law enforcement running around here quoting the Patriot Act as the reason why they can get into your Kool-Aid. Please inform them that effective 2015, the Patriot Act was no longer, and they should probably get caught up with their laws. Okay. The Computer Security Act of 1987 is one of the first attempts to protect computer systems. Now, I want you to notice, doesn't this sound like the one we just talked about right here? This last item. The Computer Security Act kind of smells like the one we just talked about, wasn't it? No, it's not. It's related, but they are a little different. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986 is not to be confused with the Computer Security Act of 1987, which basically said, okay, if you hack a federal system, you're really screwed. Okay. Now, FISMA. FISMA was a mandatory regulatory executive branch. Listen to what I'm saying now. A president of the United States enacted FISMA because that agency said, okay, we're requiring this of all federal computer systems. It was not a law passed in the legislature, but it still has teeth and you still have to meet the requirements. Then they had an update from 20,000, you'll see this a lot, 2002 to 2014. They have an update. So it's called the FISMA reform because a lot's happened since 2002 in terms of computer security, particularly the supply chain and network component. You'd be shocked at how many hacks occur when the stuff is already embedded. Does anybody know about what a digital picture frame is? Anyone? Anyone heard of a digital picture frame? Okay, well, it's kind of doesn't shock or surprise me, but because everybody has a smart TV and you can basically stream your photos on your TV, you don't have to have a smart picture frame. But about 15 years ago, they had a new kind of picture frame, and if you stuck a thumb drive into it with pictures, it would display each of those pictures on a rotating basis, kind of like a screensaver, right? So it would give you a sort of a Photoshop, a slideshow. Yes, thank you. Slideshow with rotating photo images. And these were all the rage. In fact, they were some of the best gifts for the holidays so many years ago, and they were rated in all the top magazines. Guess what happened when people took those home, plugged their USB thumb drives with their photos, and then plugged those back into their laptops? Yeah, the malware was embedded in the picture frames to begin with, and that caused a problem, okay? Now, a big part of our laws has to do with privacy, protecting digital information and privacy. And information aggregation is an important concept to understand. What do we mean? If I know your date of birth, but I don't know your social security number, then I don't really have all the pieces of what we'd call sensitive information. But if I get bits and pieces together, then I have sensitive information about you. This is what hackers do best. They get bits and pieces related, and then they stitch them all together. And when they're all aggregated or assembled together, now we're talking. Same thing is true with the federal government. You can have secret information, but if you have several chunks of secret related information, all of a sudden it becomes top secret information. And that's how people get into trouble. That's just one way of classifying the sensitivity of information. Why does that matter? Because a lot of our laws have to do with whether information or data is considered to be sensitive. An aspect of law concerns, okay, how much is this, well, risk management, how much is this asset worth? Well, what about law, cyber law? How sensitive or how damaging is this information? How protected is this category of information? In 1974, the US government said, hey, people are entitled to privacy. This is long before we ever had computers, 74. So I'm gonna try to trick you on the module assessment because I'm gonna say, how early was it in the history of computers? And I'm gonna list all these computer milestones, like the first Apple Macintosh and the first so-and-so, right? And then I'm gonna show Federal Privacy Act of 1974. That's the answer, believe it or not. It was true back then, and it's still true. The Electronic Communications Privacy Act in 1986, 86 and 87 was a big year for cyber law. The Electronic Communications Privacy Act said, yeah, people have a reasonable expectation of privacy with regard to their email, because some people thought email would be any different than hard copy letters, right? So if the government can't snoop your letters in the post office, why should they be able to snoop your email, right? Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Notice it's HIPAA, not HIPPA. It's not spelled like hippo with an I, with two P's. It's spelled with one P. HIPAA, HIPAA, 1996 was huge because it basically said medical information has to be private and protected. So digital medical records are what? Sensitive information. What is the fine for HIPAA violations? 5 years in jail and $50,000 fine mandatory for every offense.
Every offense?
And you can't waive it. A judge can't say, oh, okay, you know what? We're just going to give time served. It's mandatory sentence. Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. This is one that says, okay, the banks have to have firewalls. They have to protect. They have to notify people when their financial records are disclosed or hacked. You remember how some banks have sent letters out saying, hey, we want you to change your PIN code or we want you to change your password? That's because of the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. That's called GLBA for short, or GLBA. So HIPAA, GLBA, those are things that are really important to understand. Those are like the heavy hitting laws and what they're about. Which of the following is another name for the Financial Services Modernization Act? GLB. That's what we're dealing with. GLB, let's see if that's correct. Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, yes. Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. Now, you've probably heard of Kennedy-Kassebaum or not, and High-Tech Act. There might be some more information in here about that. Private information, protected information, PII, right? Personally identifiable information. This buzz phrase is huge. If there's digital information that can identify you as an individual, it's protected under law, and it's supposed to be private. Let's repeat that. If there is digital information that can be traced back to you as an individual, it is protected by law. It's called PII. Federal Trade Commission, right? Fraud and related activity in connection with identification documents, authentication features and information. Now we're getting into like identity theft cases. When you're using someone's password, are you or are you not standing in place of the person when you log in? Isn't that impersonation? If someone impersonated you to withdraw the funds from your physical bank account and walked off with your cash out of the bank, but it wasn't your face, wasn't you, wouldn't that be a crime? Okay, same, right? Title 18 USC 1028. Now, you're not going to get many of these Title 18s, but I want you to notice that if there's a specific section that's cited in these slides, it's important. And this one has to do with identity, right? Identification documents. Does anyone know what FTC stands for? Which federal government agency? Which basically is important to report fraud to. It's called the Federal Trade Commission. When you're purchasing e-commerce, Federal Trade Commission, fraud. Does that make sense? We're almost done. We're going to keep going. Economic Espionage Act. Believe it or not, every nation and a bunch of Fortune 500 companies and multinational corporations have been snooping on each other and stealing from each other for a long time. In 1996, we finally said, okay, enough of that. If you're going to do that on US soil, we can throw you in jail. So don't think you get to go home back to Paris. Now, non-extradition treaty countries are favorites. Let's say that again. The Economic Espionage Act means if somebody does something and they're in a foreign country, we can still go after them unless they're in a country called a non-extradition treaty country. Security and Freedom Through Encryption Act, 1999. To protect privacy, encryption is required. Encryption is a legal requirement. That's an important law. It's called SAFE, 1999. Just think of the Prince song about 1999, well, or not. Okay, intellectual property and copyright laws. The recording industry requires, it's called the Millennium. It's called the Millennium thing. Intellectual property includes all of the following except what? Which one is not covered by copyright or patent? Actually, an article from the New York Times is disseminated with copyright information. I think it's The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes because it's been around a long time. And the copyright wouldn't, see how it's 1892? So Sherlock Holmes, copyrights are only good for so many years. So, but recent, Sarbanes-Oxley says, hey, the people who run companies have to be accountable and transparent, and we have to have specific information about them. So we can't have identity theft kinds of fraud. It's the reliability and accuracy of financial reporting so that investors don't get screwed because they're putting their money into something that's shady. That's what SOX is about. And because, and that's part of cyber law, because you have to audit and report, and people are using technology to do what's called cooking the books. SOX is relevant because corporations for profit who sell stock for investors have to be ethical about what they report about their profits. If they're cooking the books to present a wow, look at how much money we're making to attract stockholders, that's fraud. And they're doing it electronically because they're cooking the books with their finance and accounting procedures. And they're using the technology to cook the books, to scramble the eggs, so to speak, so that people can't follow. Freedom of Information Act means you have to provide information. I'm going to have a separate reference to that in our addendum, but basically our federal government is required to release information upon request, and that's been around a long time. Why is that important in the context of cyber law? Since a lot of our information is digital, there are times when the federal government or our governments are compelled to provide information, even though it's digital, even though there are laws not to disseminate stuff so that hackers can't get it. Sometimes there are legal cases that are valid where people need proper information. Okay. That's all we're going to do for today. And thank you for joining us. Those are the only laws and statutes we plan to cover for Module 3, but there are so many more, especially when it comes to legal precedent and other things. I will tweak and revise the addendum for Module 3 so that they're in there. Any questions before we clear? Going once, going twice. Okay, we'll see you on Wednesday. Simeon, you had a question?